Good afternoon. Happy Economic Development Week. I hope you are celebrating the great work you do as economic developers in your community. Accreditation is one way to celebrate your economic development organization, so it's only appropriate to have this webinar during National Economic Development Week. I'm Dana Crater, Senior Associate at IADC, and the moderator for today's webinar, Becoming Accredited, a conversation on the AEDO program. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. Please note that all attendees will be muted during this webinar. To ask a question of the speakers, please type your questions into the questions box. During the conversation section of the webinar, I will pose your questions to the panelists. Within 24 hours of today's webinar, you will receive an evaluation by email. Please complete this evaluation, as we do use the feedback to improve our web seminars. At the end of this evaluation, you will receive a link to download today's presentation. If you have any questions about the AEDO program, please don't hesitate to contact me. You'll see my contact information at the end of the web seminar, and I look forward to speaking to you about your application or any questions you may have about the application process for accreditation. Okay, enough housekeeping notes on to the reason why you're here, to learn more about the AEDO program, better known as the Accredited Economic Development Organization Program. Skip Smallwood, chairman of the AEDO committee from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, is going to do a brief overview of the AEDO program, the benefits of the program, and the application process. Then Skip will pose a set of 8 questions to our panels of 3 leaders, Bradley Arnold, Joanne Crary, and Jim Fran today, who have all led organizations through the AEDO application process. Finally, I'm going to pose your questions to the panel of speakers to help you get ready to apply for accreditation. It's a busy afternoon, so let's get started with Skip.
Great. Welcome, everyone, and hopefully you'll find this to be a very informative and really good webinar. What we're going to talk about today is first an overview of the AEDO program and provide what are the goals and benefits first. As you can see, there are 4 what we highlight are the key goals and benefits. 1, naturally, it's going to recognize excellent economic development organizations, but more importantly, it'll also heighten your visibility in your community. And then it also provides some independent feedback on your operations, and we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get into the actual review teams. And then finally, we'll acknowledge the organization's leaders' vital contribution to the economic development process. So basically, what does the program examine? First off, we look at the professional leadership, we look at the staffing and to make sure it's adequate to fulfill the mission. And then we do dive into the budgets, we look at the annual audits, and we look at your resources. And then we're very interested too of learning about the support from the community and region, and more importantly, the commitment and the participation level. And then finally, we do dive in also into the strategic plan, and while also making sure there's allocation of resources based once again on the mission and identified opportunities. So the question always comes up, what do AEDOs earn? What EDOs earn the accreditation? As you can see by the list, we have a lot of different economic development organizations that have achieved the AEDO designation. We, of course, naturally have the public-private partnerships. We also have utilities. We actually have 2 investor-owned utilities that are AEDO. We also have state and local economic development departments. In fact, as we speak, we actually have a review team that is in the state of Louisiana and reviewing their application. Also private nonprofit business associations. We have international EDOs, and then we also have SBA lenders. And I do want to shout out to the Colorado Lending Source. They are an AEDO organization. As you can see on the benefits of accreditation, there's an internal value, and that's always, I think, the common question that comes up. What's the value proposition? Why should I really do this? So from an internal perspective, number 1, it's recognition as a leading EDO, and also it enhances your authority on economic development issues, but it also assists in increasing the private sector investment. And it also, you always want to celebrate successes as well. And and through the program, we have found that also as an internal value. The external value, of course, you're always looking for that advantage or how you differentiate yourself from other EDOs, and this is one of those programs that actually does this. As the CECD does for you as an individual who's as active in the economic development community, the same for an organization. You want to differentiate yourself from competitors. It also demonstrates how you're allocating your resources and pulling everybody together for that common goal and mission. But more importantly, it provides for prospects, and I think this is a really important part, with the confidence that you have a capable leadership and active community support. And how the AEDOs rate the program, of course, the benefits, of course, you do get the recognition, and of course, you also get from the reports, and I do want to place some emphasis on those reports, because when the review team completes its report and then ultimately voted on by the AEDO Advisory Committee, there are recommendations that are made, and ranging from succession planning to maybe even taking another look at budgeting issues or maybe even looking at staffing. But those are very important because it also helps your board in the planning process as well. Some other important benefits, of course, remember this is a peer mentorship that is also provided during the site visit. So as the site team is there reviewing a lot of the different documentation and having meetings with the stakeholders, it also gives you an opportunity to have some mentoring as well. Maybe there's a specific area you're really having your struggles with, and just by chance there may be some individuals on the review team may have some expertise in those particular areas. It also helps, as you can see, with the credibility of funding and also marketing opportunities. But also it's as you, and we've had this feedback from quite a few of the AEDOs that have gone through the process, that the documentation phase is really important, not only for us on the review side, but also for the organizations, but it helps them to refresh themselves and make sure that they're staying on track with their mission. And of course, it also increases your exposure through IDC. If you get the IDC weekly news blast, you always will see something in there about an AEDO that's been recognized. And so you do get that recognition, and also on the specific website for AEDO. So how does the process actually work? There's actually two phases. First is what we call the documentation review, and then you'll see later phase two is the actual site visit itself. And what happens is when an organization makes an application, we immediately assign, depending on the size, typically 2 individuals from the AEDO Advisory Committee to basically oversee and review the documentation that is submitted. And as you can see on this slide, there's a lot of information that we require in part of the review. And before anybody gets all excited and thinks about how we've got to mail all this stuff in, we're actually set up where we utilize what's called Dropbox. So you can put the documentation there, and then of course our review team has access, and that can be used then to complete their checklist. But as you can see, we do look at the missions and goals statement. We do look at the strategic plan, the marketing plan. We look at the budgets, not only the annual audits, but we also look at the budgets themselves. And then we're also very interested in a review of the successful development projects. During the review itself, we're asking lots of questions. And it's typically what happens once the information is sent in, the review team will probably most likely do follow-up and ask additional questions. They will look at, as I said earlier, they'll look at those mission statements and goal statements because they want to make sure there's alignment to what the documentation says to the mission statement. They also want to look at your incorporation and bylaws. That's very critical. And as I said, the audits, and then the annual report as well. But also we want to look at your last 4 board meetings. We want to look at the minutes just to see how the ebb and flow goes. And then we're interested in the actual staff itself, especially the officers, what's the description of their roles, responsibilities. We want to look at the org chart to see how the staff is set up, who supervises who. And as I said earlier, we also look at the marketing plan and strategic plan. And as you can see, looking on this next slide, there's even more materials. We even look at your current marketing materials, your budget, once again, your budget. And as you can tell, we really do dive into the budget, the financial side, because we're looking at sustainability to make sure your organization can continue to grow and has the financial support. Well, we do ask for an IRS Form 990. We do look at your staff policy and also your procedures manual. And then more importantly, we're looking for letters of commitment of support from not only your stakeholders, but for those of you that may work for government agencies, maybe the county commissioner or the mayor. We're looking for the letter of support from those type of individuals. And then also we want to see your successes and what involvement your staff or your organization had in those successes. We're interested in your newsletters, any press releases, and then finally we're looking at your actual resumes of what we call your executive staff. Once the review team has gathered all this information and had all their questions answered, then the review team will proceed with writing up a report and making an appropriate recommendation to the full AEDO committee. At that time, then the AEDO committee will decide, does the application move forward to the next phase, or do they require to go back and ask further questions? When you move into the next phase, which is phase 2, which is the actual site team visit, these are usually about a day and a half activities, but the 2 individuals that are on the first phase review team are typically on the phase 2 review as well. So there's naturally a community tour, but then there's corporate visits, there's meetings with community leaders, and those are really key meetings, or what we call the stakeholder meetings, because it gives us an opportunity to ask questions among the stakeholders. Maybe they had a particular project, like an expansion, for example, and we're interested in learning more about how that organization interacted with that company. And of course, we do staff interviews because we're interested in their roles and any issues or things that the review team needs to know about. Once everything is completed, then the review team comes back from their site visit. They'll write, once again, another report based on the site visit findings and then make appropriate recommendations. And at that time, then the AEDO advisory committee, once again, will vote to whether to grant accreditation or not. I do want to keep in mind, it's not a pass-fail process. Basically, is you're getting a peer review, but making sure that all the documentation's in place, and then of course during the site visit, making sure that the key issues are adequately addressed. Once you're accredited, the accreditation is good for 3 years. Then you can get subsequently 2 additional reaccreditations without a site visit, provided that there has been no leadership change. So every 3 years, you can go up to 9 years if there's been no leadership change for reaccreditation without a site visit. And then it's after that 9th year, then you, once again, when you go up for reaccreditation, then there'll be a new site visit. As you can see then on the next slide, there is a celebration phase. And I think it's always important in economic development. You want to do that, of course, you get a plaque that designates you as an AEDO, but more importantly, there's press release. There, as I mentioned earlier on the weekly email blasts that go out, there's recognition paid to those organizations. There also you get AEDO logos. We do strongly encourage the AEDO organizations to put the logo not only on their website, but we have a few that actually put them on their business cards and even on some of their letterheads. So they proudly announce that they are an AEDO, because AEDO is really becoming a highly recognized program. And you'll see in a minute a slide I'll show you of where the AEDOs are located in the United States. In fact, we also have in Canada and Mexico as well. So this truly is an international accreditation program. The most important thing also is once you get the accreditation, you also get a copy of the actual site visit report and the appropriate recommendations. And the site review team is always available if there's any follow-up questions to make sure that there's no questions or maybe there's not some clarity in what recommendations have been made. Everybody does ask this question, and this is why it's so important that when you're considering going to the AEDO, that you really contact Dana Crater at the onset, because Dana can give you the specific dollars of what it would cost for the application. But typically the application fee is $275, and then it's $300 for the state level organization. And then the actual accreditation fee is based on a sliding scale, as you can see on this slide. And of course, when there is a site visit involved, and I do want to stress this is important, that when the review team comes on site, it is that organization's responsibility to pick up the transportation costs, meals, and any accommodation. So that's really important to remember. So when you're budgeting for this and you're considering AEDO, you need to kind of keep all this in mind. But like I said, if you're wanting to know the actual accreditation fee, please contact Dana and she can give you more information on that. The next two slides, actually the next few slides, give you kind of an idea of some of the organizations that have received the AEDO designation. Some of these names may be familiar to you, maybe development organizations that are right next to yours. So you can kind of look at this, kind of give you an idea. CenterPoint Energy, I want to single out. They were actually our first utility, investor-owned utility that became accredited. In fact, they're up for reaccreditation right now. And I mentioned Colorado Lending Source is an SBA program, and that was actually our first and right now only SBA type program that has gone through the accreditation. You can see on the next slide, there's Greater Halifax. That was the one I mentioned from Canada. And I won't go through all these, but as you can get an idea, and you'll see in a minute the map, you can get an idea of where all these organizations are located. So Ponca City, on the next slide, we just accredited Las Vegas this year. So we've got a pretty wide disbursement of organizations, and we'll just keep kind of going through these. So the slide I really want to show you is the map of the United States, and as you can see where the stars are, these are all where our AEDOs are located. We have roughly about 60, 63, 64, the number fluctuates all the time, organizations that right now are accredited. This is a program that has become very popular. And in fact, we've had some organizations that were accredited maybe as far back as maybe 10, 12 years ago and let their accreditation expire, have actually come back now and become reaccredited. And a good example is Ready in Columbia, Missouri. They were one of the early organizations that became accredited, let it expire, but now they were very enthusiastic and aggressively going after the reaccreditation again, and we did accredit them last year. So as you can see on the map, we do have a widespread representation around the United States. So with that pretty much concludes my comments as far as an overview of the program. Like I said, we do have a website you can go to that has some general information about the program. But more importantly, if you have real specific questions or if you're interested in the cost, the timing, things like that, please contact Dana Crater, directly call her. Her information is on the website, and she can provide more of that information. With that, I'm going to move on now to our panel because I think this is really important because unfortunately we don't have Paul Saldana with us today. He had an emergency back home, but we do have three other individuals who have gone through the AEDO process, and we think it's very important that you hear from them, why they did it, what were the outcomes, how they used this program. And so they're going to share with you some of their experiences. And before I give their bios, what we'll do is we'll ask them specific questions, and then we'll let them each answer on their experience. So let me kind of go through who our panelists are today. First, we have Bradley Arnold. He's the county administrator for Sumter County in Wildwood, Florida. And Sumter County Economic Development became accredited in 2017. As the county administrator, Bradley was involved in the application from the county management perspective. Next, we have Joanne Crary, and she's the president of Saginaw Future Incorporated in Saginaw, Michigan. And Saginaw Future was accredited in 2015 and is currently preparing for reaccreditation. And then lastly, we have Jim Fram, and he's the founder and principal of Community Growth Strategies, LLC in Osage Beach, Missouri. Jim has actually led two organizations through the AEDO application process. First, the Tulsa Regional Chamber in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was originally accredited in 2012. And then the Hot Springs Metro Partnership in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was originally accredited in 2016. So with those introductions, what I'd like to do now is to move on and ask each one of them specific questions. And then later on, as Dana mentioned earlier, you have an opportunity to ask questions yourself. I believe there's a chat box that you can type your questions in, and Dana will then relay those questions to our panelists, and because we want to make sure if you have any questions, those questions get answered. So let's move into our first question, and we'll start with Joanne first, and then we'll go with Bradley and Jim to answer this. The first question is, why did you decide to pursue the AEDO accreditation? Joanne?
Well, thanks a lot, Skip, and thanks, Dana, and thanks to everyone who's on the phone considering this AEDO program. We decided to pursue it probably in 2014, and my original thought was I hired a staff person, and it was a great way to get her to really know the organization backwards and forwards. But overall, I think just being recognized as an accredited economic development organization really demonstrates to our existing and prospective clients that we're able to deliver professional economic development services at a high level. We have a vision of being recognized as the premier organization providing proactive and focused economic development. And so this really helps us take that next step of getting and achieving our vision.
Great, thank you. Bradley, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, not to restate the program goals, but we really do focus as an organization countywide, but even more so within our economic development activities, we have a strong commitment to continuous improvement. And, you know, we spend a lot of time with our existing industry providing that support and making sure that we're staying on top of any of the issues that are related to them. And we view that as part of that continuous improvement cycle. And being accredited, having that distinction, especially for an organization, when we went through the accreditation process of only 3 people, now 4 from the accreditation activity, that, you know, being able to have that competitive difference, to be able to be recognized as an accredited agency, even though we're small, just like Joanne stated, provides that level of distinction of professionalism that people can expect because we're an accredited agency. We also really focus with all of our operations that we have more accredited services as a county government than any other county in the state of Florida. And so we most certainly wanted to have our economic development operation among that distinction.
Jim, do you have any comments?
Sure do. Very much agree with Joanne and Bradley. With us, in both cases, in Tulsa and in Hot Springs, it was very much a credibility issue, very much like accreditation for higher ed. We were raising a lot of dollars from the private sector, and we felt like the AEDO program would give us that little extra credibility that we needed to really sell our program to investors.
Great, thank you. And one point I want to make, and Bradley kind of touched on this a little bit, lots of times we're asked the question, well, we're too small of an organization. And as you just heard, you know, it can go from a 3-man staff up to a 20-man. It doesn't make any difference. If you want to be recognized as a professional economic development organization, that's why AEDO is so important. So size really shouldn't become an obstacle in becoming AEDO. Let me move on to the next question. And I think this is an important question because oftentimes the feedback that we do receive from organizations that are considering going with AEDO, it involves the board of directors and convincing them to not only take the time and also the expense of going through the process, but the value. What is the value we get in return? So the question that I want to pose, and we'll start with Bradley on this first, is how did you persuade your board of directors or your local stakeholders to invest in accreditation? Bradley?
Yeah, I had a little bit of an easier process. I have 5 elected officials that make up the governing board for the county. And we actually had 3 of our services, Public Works through the American Public Works Association, our Fire Operations Emergency Management, had just come out of their accreditation process successfully, so we were already batting 1,000. And I think the board recognized that the value from the recommendations, that peer review activity, the recommendations that came from the prior accreditation activities was the most important thing that really swayed the board, that it really was an investment and the return was peer recommendations to further improve the delivery of our services.
Thank you. Jim, you've actually been involved in two different organizations, one large and one a little smaller, and kind of share your perspective on how that particular question was addressed with the two different organizations.
Sure. Really in both cases, Skip, we kind of went through the process and felt like that the board felt it was important that even though we were doing very well at managing the organization, that this would be kind of a look or an inspection from the outside. And again, they felt like it was a good investment for us to take part in the exercise and to make the investment in the accreditation process.
Okay, thank you. And then Joanne, your experience.
Well, thanks, Skip. You know, our board is comprised of a cross-section of business, labor, education, government, and nonprofits. And we communicated our desire to pursue the AEDO designation, and they all agreed that it was a priority and it adds credibility to the organization, as well as to our funders. So it really didn't take much effort. It's really what Bradley talked about, of having that continuous improvement and the goals of being the best organization that we can be. So it wasn't tough to persuade them at all to apply for accreditation, because so many of them actually are accredited, or they have whatever quality standards are in the market for their industry. So it was kind of a no-brainer for us that it was, you know, something that we wanted to pursue.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next question, and I think we sometimes receive this feedback when the process starts for an organization and they see, oh wow, there's a lot of materials that have to be gathered. Let's ask the question then, how did you begin getting the application materials together? And we'll start with Jim.
Thank you. It really, in both cases, in Tulsa, we had a very large staff, so there were a lot of staff involvement in getting the material together. But really, in both communities, we made sure that we had some volunteer leadership from the board and set up basically subcommittees that kind of looked at each area, because we wanted to be sure that everything was looked over well before we submitted it to the AEDO committee for consideration. Getting the volunteer board members involved really helped us with some other issues down the road, because it really gave them an insight into the day-to-day management of both organizations.
Thank you. Joanne, your thoughts?
Oh, that was great, Jim. I wish we would have gotten our volunteer leadership involved. I never even thought of doing that. We actually just held a staff meeting and we talked through all the items that were required. And the same as Jim, we assigned, you know, each one of our staff members to, or actually everyone volunteered to be the point person for the individual pieces. And then we had one person on our team to pull together the entire application. The interesting thing was that it was really helpful to us because it made us update our resumes and make sure that our strategic plan was really up to date and it addressed today's issues. It required us to be a little more disciplined in some of the things that we just took for granted because we've been around for 25 years. We just continue to operate, and it was a really good way for us to kind of get a lot of our act together in certain areas that we were just too busy with in the past.
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
That's pretty funny, and Joanne's commentary, because for us, it was a two-person tag team event with Jada Glover being the lead, and she was my subordinate, but she was assigning me the tasks to help put together the application materials. But just like Joanne talked about, the biggest issue for us was starting with the strategic plan and making sure that it was not only current, but then looking at our supporting documents that fall from the strategic plan, like our marketing plan, to make sure that our documents were clearly aligned as part of the application process. So that internal review, just like Joanne talked about, really freshened us up in regard to validating our mission, our objectives as we submitted the application.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next question, and this is involving the actual site visit itself. And so Bradley, we'll start with you on this. Can you describe the actual site visit and your interaction with the AEDO site visit team?
Well, there's always that apprehension when you're about to expose not only your elected officials, but also the business stakeholders within the community to folks that you've not met personally. Because the last thing you want to do is damage the relationship that you have, that you fought so hard to gain. And I will tell you, Jerry Stewart and Gary Hines dressed professional, conducting themselves in a professional manner, that I was very proud to be associated with IEDC and their participation. And actually, as we went through and they got to speak to our stakeholders, talk to the elected officials, it was really nice because all the participants on our side of the fence, if you will, walked away feeling even stronger about the accreditation process, that it was thorough, that they asked the appropriate questions. And so once we were able to gain the recognition as an accredited organization, the stakeholders celebrated with us because they knew that it was not, in the Navy term, gun decking the process. It was an appropriate site visit review of our documentation and how we conduct ourselves as an economic development organization.
Thank you. Joanne, do you want to comment on the site visits?
Sure, and in fact, I'll comment on our site visit, but then I actually got to do a site visit, and it was an amazing experience. So we had two members of the site visit team, Barbara Hayes and Sharon Ward, and Sharon's been involved in this organization and this program for many years, and she's just has a wealth of knowledge because she's been to on so many site visits. We worked with them to coordinate their travel schedules, and then our team scheduled meetings with our local university, our utility, largest manufacturer. We held a lunch with a couple of our bankers, and then they came into our office and evaluated our office setting and our equipment, our facilities, and our internal operations. And then each of our staff members talked about their role in the organization, and were able to meet one-on-one. The site review team met one-on-one with our higher level staff. We followed that with a dinner with our leadership staff to debrief and answer questions. And then on the second day, we had them meet with the Chamber of Commerce and the county board chairman. And then we met again to discuss, the overall kind of feedback on the site visit and the recommendations, and then the follow-up process. So it was very professional, very encouraging. You just felt like when you heard some of the wonderful comments people were making, it was just, made me want to work at this another 20 years. But I also had the opportunity to go to Tampa and do a site visit, and we met with 45 leaders in 2 days. So it was just, I feel like I could move to Tampa now. I learned so much about the community, but it was a pretty amazing process. Very professional.
Great, thank you. And Jim, your thoughts?
We treated both in Tulsa and in Hot Springs, we treated the site visit very much like you would a visit from a business prospect, and had our board members, our community leaders, people who the site visit committee was going to be meeting with, kind of briefed in advance and prepared and ready, and they were very familiar with our material that we had sent in. Again, it was a day and a half visit, and I likened it very much like a business prospect visit, and it was a learning experience for us, a learning experience for our board, and I think everybody, both staff and volunteers and board member and community leaders, gained a lot from the insights in being able to interact with the site visit committee.
Great, thank you. And I do want to point out too, because I know some organizations have asked this, and they know that we require a lot of documentation, and especially during the site visits, we're learning a lot more about the organizations, about the materials that are shared. And we're actually starting to implement this now, actually having us sign non-disclosure forms that the information is shared, stays with that organization, and of course with the report. So if anybody is wondering about that, that information that's during those site visits, that stays with that organization. It's not shared with any other organization. So I just wanted to make that clear. The next question is the actual report itself. As I mentioned during the phase 2, there actually is a report that's presented to the AEDO organization and with appropriate recommendations. So we'll start with you, Joanne. What were your thoughts as far as the AEDO review team's insights, and were the recommendations themselves very helpful?
Well, we learned a lot along the way, like Jim talked about, but the site review team had a couple of very insightful recommendations related to fundraising. They both had experiences that they were able to share, and because Sharon had been to a lot of communities, she had some ideas and concepts on best practices. So we discussed our board's role as it relates to being personally committed, as well as serving in a fundraising function, which we haven't done a lot in the past. And then the other recommendation was very timely because it had to do with our organization getting involved and marketing ourselves as a region, and encouraging us and encouraging our board to give up that control so that we didn't feel like we had to market our own county to actually be part of this regional attraction effort. So they were helpful, and we implemented the second one. The first one we work on, every time we do a campaign. So it was definitely helpful.
Thank you, Bradley. Your thoughts?
Yeah, we had, the first thing I think is important for people that are looking to move into this process is the insights and recommendations. There were no surprises, if you will, that as the review team was preparing to share the insights recommendations, those were done verbally and discussed before they were formalized. So that's one of the things that organizations need to feel comfortable with, that they're going to see, and all of that information before it ever moves out in any type of formal presentation. And for us, it was sort of funny that the Jada at the time had not disclosed to everyone that she was pregnant. And one of the recommendations was to, add a staff member because of our extensive BREP activity that we're involved in, and that we needed some additional coverage. And so, we felt that it was important, Jada specifically, to go ahead and share with the review team that, she was pregnant, and asked them to keep it confidential. But the timing of the recommendation was good once the announcement was made, because that provided additional support for the position as we were moving into the budgetary process. So we got her title changed. We added the additional position. Those were two of the principal recommendations which have been implemented. The last one is Jada and I are relatively new into IEDC, and so neither one of us had our CCD, and that was the other recommendation that both she and I have been working towards. So the insights and recommendations were helpful for our organization.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Yes, one of the things, I'm going to take a little bit different twist on this. One of the things that really was helpful to us in Tulsa and in Hot Springs, during this process, if you have a local issue that maybe you've been timid about pushing forward, you can mention that to the review team, and a lot of times if that comes back as a recommendation or even a suggestion from a review team, it's kind of the scenario of, somebody from out of town has a little more influence than maybe you do. So if there are some of those things that you can be sure and let that review team know about, and then they can bring that back in the form of a recommendation, it packs a lot more weight with your volunteers and your board, and is really helpful to you in getting those things accomplished.
Great, thank you. Move on to the next question. We'll start with you, Bradley, and I think this is probably a real good question here, is what do you see as the primary benefit of accreditation?
Well, again, it goes back to the continuous improvement commitment. It's not only the recognition of our dedication to it, but that peer review activity is just so important because, again, you can get very focused in your operations and miss some of the forest and having that peer review come in and be able to point out, in our instance, you're doing a good job, but understand you're about to be overwhelmed. You probably need another position to be able to carry forward with all the business retention expansion activities that we're involved in. And the second one is really, the AEDO brand adds, as we've already talked about, credibility towards our economic development organization. So we're able to hook onto an international branding for our organization, and for a small organization and a local government organization, that's very important.
Thank you, Jim.
Credibility again. In Hot Springs, Arkansas, we were the first and only organization in the state to get the AEDO, and that garnered us a lot of publicity, not just in our community, but statewide. To Bradley's point, you may really feel like you got everything in order and everything going right, but it never hurts to have a little bit of peer review from outside the organization to help you tweak things and really get them in line.
Thank you. And Joanne?
And I agree, there's not a lot I can add. I think just going through that process provided the opportunity to assess where we were as an organization and identify our strengths and reveal some work we needed to do for continuous improvement. It also allowed everyone on our team to have input on updating our strategic plan and be up to date on where we were on our budget and financials. And, everybody had to update their resumes, which was a good exercise. But again, I think it was very fulfilling and encouraging to see all the support letters and hear about all the excellent comments made by our stakeholders. And then, this is a big one, is having that accreditation sets us all apart as one of the premier organizations in North America. We're one of only 10% of IEDC members holding this designation, so it is significant.
Thank you. Next question is how did you capitalize on the accreditation to help further promote your organization? And we'll start with you, Jim.
We fairly immediately put the AEDO logo on business cards, on our letterhead, on our website, on email newsletters that we sent out, basically on everything, kind of shouting to the world that we were now an accredited organization. And like I mentioned earlier on the last question, we garnered a ton of very, very positive support for our organization, not just locally, but statewide.
Great. Joanne, your thoughts?
Similar. We had a lot of media coverage, but we also have it on our letterhead, any of our press releases, our website, social media. Each staff person has it as part of their signature on their emails, and it's listed in our annual report, our newsletters, and all of our marketing materials. So the thing is that IEDC helps you with that. They provide that logo for you. They give you ideas of where to use it. They're very helpful. So you don't have to just make all this up and get your press release done. They have a template and really are helpful.
Bradley?
Yeah, I don't have much else to add. We did exactly what Jim did, that's for sure. And we also utilized the services of IEDC, just like Joanne mentioned.
Great, thank you. Let me cite one good example too. I don't know how many of you know David Leeser in St. Charles, Missouri. David does a Monday morning, what he calls Monday Morning Minute, and about a couple weeks ago, he actually highlighted AEDO, and he got a very good response from that. So once again, taking advantage and promoting it. So good information. Our last question we're going to ask is to all the individuals attending this webinar, and we'll start with you, Bradley, on this. What's the most important advice you would give an organization considering accreditation?
The first one is just simply don't fear the process. Again, we were a 3-person organization moving into the application process. That's the first, is don't fear the process. The second is, go ahead and start early in pulling out your strategic plan. Make sure it's not an off-the-shelf document, that it's actually something that you are working and looking at on a more frequent basis, is to go ahead and move forward with that review and update, because as soon as you make it through that process, honestly, going through an AEDO application and providing the rest of the documentation is actually pretty easy. It's that update to the strategic plan is really what I think holds some people back, and they just need to push through that activity.
Okay. Joanne, your thoughts?
I would say to set about a 3 to 6 month time frame to get the information together, and you know, take time to review the requirements, designate somebody on your team to help pull the information together, be the point person, and be sure you have support in your community and leaders willing to stand up for you and meet with the review team. Stay organized. I mean, again, we're going through the reaccreditation process right now. And the nice thing is that when you go, after you go through the initial accreditation, it's really just updating the information. You don't have a site review team the next time. As long as you don't have a change in leadership, you know, it's really, it's not a difficult process. Oh, and the last thing I'd say is IEDC questions, because they are very helpful when you're going through the process.
Good, thank you. Jim?
I think the old adage applies here that it's the process is a marathon and not a sprint. And my advice would be to be slow but be deliberate. And the other thing would be to involve as many people as you can, both from your staff and from your volunteer board and committees.
Very good. Well, I want to thank Bradley, Joanne, and Jim for answering our questions as you saw presented on the slides. And at this time, I'm going to throw this back over to Dana because she can see what questions are being submitted on the chat side. And like I said, if you do have any questions, type your questions in, and then Dana can forward those on to Bradley, Joanne, or Jim. So Dana, I'm going to throw it back to you and let you throw any questions that anybody may be asking.
So our first question is, how do you look at things when economic development is only one program in an organization?
How do you look at things? I don't quite understand the question.
So, and I think, Jim, you might be a good person to answer this question to start. So, for instance, an organization where economic development is one focus, but then there may be a chamber of commerce or a CVB or a downtown partnership.
With Tulsa, we were part of the Tulsa Regional Chamber, and our economic development program was one of 5 major divisions within that chamber. And obviously we involved the staff and the leadership from the economic development program, but we also involved people from communications and other venues throughout the chamber, which was an advantage in being in a much larger organization. In Hot Springs, we had 2 separate organizations, a Chamber of Commerce and an economic development partnership, but we shared leadership and staff in both of those. And so it was somewhat the same way. You just worked toward accrediting that part of your program that was directly related to economic development and involved the other parts of the organization where it was applicable.
Skip, this will be a question for you. How would this work for a regional council of governments, for example?
It's probably no different than what we did with the SBA, because regional council governments, I'm familiar with how they're structured. They would basically demonstrate how they're contributing and supporting economic development. They have a lot of partners they're working with, and we would just ask them, like all the other organizations, you know, you should have some type of strategic plan. You know, you have a set that you have to put together so many years. You know, we would consider that your strategic plan. What are you doing to market the region? A lot of regional organizations do have that. Our planning commissions have that document in place. They have staff members that are dedicated toward economic development functions. So, yeah, we have not had any applications as of this date for planning commissions, but there definitely is an opportunity for them to consider, just like we did with the Colorado Lending Source, is basically focusing on SBA lending. It's all economic development, and so that's why it worked for them, and it would be a natural fit for planning commissions as well.
For a community that is smaller size, under 50,000, with one full-time economic development employee, plus a director who's also responsible for planning and development, are they too small to consider AEDO accreditation?
This is Brad. I can sort of jump in. I don't think they're too small to be considered. I mean, although my position is county administrator and I have a lot of different services that I'm responsible for, I still dedicate a good chunk of my time to economic development activities because especially if we're involved in incentive, contract provision and those things, you know, I have to sign off on before we move forward with it. So even if it's a one-person show, the documentation is still the same. That would have to be in place to show under what strategic plan, what your marketing plan is, and how you're going about conducting your business, because even with a one-person organization, as Jim had already talked about, that person may have a significant volunteer base to be able to help affect economic development within the community.
Thank you. What was the most difficult part of the accreditation process?
Getting started. I think getting past that hurdle of compiling the material and the application and organizing it, the getting started was probably the hardest part from my point of view.
And this, Bradley, I will agree with Jim. It's just getting that momentum is the hardest part. But once you're involved in it and moving forward, you know, you start knocking out the checklist and getting everything submitted.
The only thing I would add is that we're all busy. I don't know any economic developer who's got time on their hands. And so when you think about one more thing, it's sometimes, and look at the requirements, sometimes you think it's overwhelming, but it's really not. There's no deadline. So you can start this and you can take 5 or 6 months, or you can take a month. It's really up to your organization and where you are, but it's getting started is the most important part, and just start ticking it off of the things on the list, and you will be surprised when you do get there. It's not as difficult as it seems.
And Dana, this is Skip. Would you say probably the longest we've seen an organization maybe took up to a year before they actually formally submitted their documentation?
You know, I'd also say we've seen a couple organizations where they're not ready. They're still working on their strategic plan, but they have it in their mind as they're putting together their strategic plan. They're putting together their marketing plan. So it takes a couple. It takes some time for them to get all the pieces together for the documentation, but they have it as part of their goal. So it kind of drives the process for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thanks.
And just as a reminder, you can submit questions in the question box on your control panel. So I guess based on the question we just had, how long did it take to put the application together from start to finish?
This is Bradley. I'm going to say that we probably had a focused time of 3 months of compiling all the documents for submission, and a lot of that, as Joanne had mentioned, was when you start the process and you make the commitment to start going through that checklist, you start making revisions to the documents, and it's an internal review before you actually upload those documents as part of the formal application process.
I think our time frame is 3 to 4 months in both communities.
Same here, about 3. It seems like it was between 3 and 4 months.
Does the economic development leader need to attend every meeting, interview during the site visit?
They don't have to. In fact, in some case, they probably would rather have you not in the room because then they can talk openly, speak openly with some of the leaders. you know, it depends on where you're at. When I went down to Tampa to do the site visit, the leaders weren't in the room, and in many of the cases, when they came here to my organization, I was in most of them, but not all of them, especially when they talked to other staff members, because they really wanted to get a feel for, you know, their role and how they feel in the organization. Do they feel like they're being treated right? Do they have upward mobility? What are some of the challenges that they see? And they had to feel a comfort level that whatever they said was going to be kept confidential.
Bradley, I would agree with Joanne. I did about 75% of the meetings, and staff provided the support dual with me or you know, individually.
I intentionally stayed out of as many of those interviews as I could, because I really felt like one of the benefits was going to be getting some real good, honest, sound feedback from the team that came in and did the inspection.
Yeah, and this is Skip. I've been on quite a few review team site visits, and we typically do not have the economic developer in the room. You know, we work with them in setting up the agenda. Once we put the feet on the ground and we start meeting with a lot of individuals, with the exception of the staff, when we get into the stakeholder meetings, typically it's pretty much the review team talking to the stakeholders without the economic developer or any of the staff members in the room. The only thing we ask is to keep us on time, because there is a pretty tight time crunch to make sure we're flowing from meeting to meeting to meeting. But other than that, I cannot recall, with the exception of maybe when we had maybe a dinner with the board itself, we did not have the economic developer with the stakeholders.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, the question box is on your panel. What's the difference between reaccreditation and accreditation?
Skip, do you want to take that?
Okay. Well, of course, the accreditation, you know, when you're first time, that's a very thorough process, and that's, of course, where we do the first two phases. The reaccreditation is basically where you're updating your materials, but I will need to point out most of the review teams will go back and look at the previous reports to see what changes have occurred based on the current application. And of course, if there was a leadership change then you basically would go through as if you were starting all over again. But you're still going through the same documentation process. You're probably going to still get the same type of questions. The only difference is, like I said, on the accreditation, the first time out, that's where you're going through the first two phases.
Well, I think for our final question, as I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, what would you think is the most important thing for someone considering applying for accreditation to take away from today's webinar? Bradley, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's one of those, I'll say, confirm that you have the support of your team, support of your board and stakeholders, as Joanne talked about, making sure that the stakeholders are on board, and as Jim talked about, also make sure the stakeholders understand, you know, especially once you get to the site team visit, you know, to be honest and open and about the feedback, because again, even the stakeholders' feedback to the review team is helpful in that peer review in regard to improving operations. But ultimately, you know, if you're not committed, again, to continuous improvement, then, you know, this may not be for you. But if you are wanting to continue to improve your economic development organization, you know, you're going to get a significant return on investment through the peer review process and the international recognition.
Joanne,
This webinar.
Oh, no, go ahead,
Jim.
This webinar, the IEDC website, the newsletters that IEDC sends out, gathering all the information you can on the front end before you begin a process is very helpful. And I think this webinar, if I went back in time, would be very, very helpful, and I would have found it very useful in starting a process.
Most important takeaway is that you can do this. It's not overwhelming, and once you get it done, you'll be so proud of your organization, and it'll be so well worth your time and energy.
Yep.
Yeah, and let me just add too, I've had the opportunity to actually come back on the ones that I've actually been involved in the reviews, where I've actually come back and made the formal presentation to the organization in front of their board, or in one case, Go Topeka was to their Joint Economic Development Council, and it was really a celebration, and there was a pride factor as well, and they really made those organizations I came back to and actually presented their plaque and recognized them for this achievement. It really gave them that momentum to continue to move forward. So that's kind of after the fact, after you go through the process, but it's keeping that momentum going afterwards, because you kind of like to Go Topeka, for example, like Jim said, for Arkansas, Go Topeka is the only one in Kansas right now. So there is that sense of pride.
And with that, I'd like to thank Bradley, Joanne, and Jim for sharing their experiences with the AEDO program with us this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Skip for sharing his insights on the AEDO program. I'd like to thank you for tuning into today's webinar. If you have any questions or are considering applying for accreditation, please contact me. We can talk through the program. We can answer any questions you may have, and I can help with anything that you're wondering about the program. You can also find the guide to becoming an AEDO, which we just updated earlier this year at www.idconline.org/AEDO. As a reminder, you will receive this presentation there'll be a link at the end of the evaluation that will be emailed to you within the next 24 hours or so. Please take a few minutes to honestly complete the survey, as it does help us plan future webinars and AEDO programming. And on behalf of IEDC and the AEDO program, I'd like to thank you again for participating, and we hope to see your organization on the AEDO map in the future. Happy Economic Development Week.